Khuresh, a land of mystery and snakemen, a land forgotten by time and seemingly Games Workshop. In this video today, we'll be expanding our previous coverage of the Hinterlands of Khuresh fan project and go into some of the lore that this amazing team has put together, as well as speculating on how they might be put into Total War Warhammer 3. So let me just hit that elephant in the room up front. I am well aware of the statement that Andy Hall made on the podcast that I did with him, but I can still have fun speculating and talking about something that might not actually be put into the game. What makes these videos fun is not the actuality of their inclusion into Warhammer 3, but rather the possibility in a fun, sort of speculative manner. Also, just a quick note on Andy's statement. The very nature of an NDA prevents him from even saying that a project such as Nippon or Khuresh coming into Warhammer 3 is in existence. I'm not saying I doubted him, but I'm just saying that if we end up getting one or even all three of these factions in the future or in the years to come, I won't be completely surprised. In the past, though, we have read word for word the lore that the team has made for these units, but in this iteration we're going to summarize each unit's lore entry and instead cover more units. I have some catching up to do here as there's been 9 or so units added since my last coverage. And after we discuss that lore, we'll then talk about possible rules in Total War Warhammer 3. Before we get started, I'm going to provide links in the description to the fan project's website, each individual social, all that action, so please go and support the team by just visiting and following them, whatever it is. This is, of course, a fan project. There's no profit involved, nothing like that, and it's not associated with Games Workshop, but I, again, just want to point out all of their relevant links so you can actually go find the true source of all this action. And also, if you are enjoying the video, please don't forget to comment, like, or subscribe before you head out. I can't tell you how much that means to me, and it does really help the channel grow. Let's talk about some Khuresh units, starting with the Spitting Naja warriors. And the Spitting Naja are a pretty interesting unit here to talk about. We've already talked about the Sarpa warrior, which is basically the kind of like the bottom tier, I guess, more or less. And it's hard to say bottom tier because the Sarpa are pretty elite. But if the Sarpa warrior is the Saurus of the Khureshi hinterlands, or the Hinterlands of Khuresh, then the Spitting Naja are a little bit more comparable to the Skink, just in the sense of their role on the battlefield. The Sarpa is a frontline warrior type unit that jumps up close and personal. It has a whole bunch of armament attached to it. It's got halberds, it's got crisp spears, it's got a bunch of different things and shields. The Spitting Naja have a bit of a different role here. They're more of a skirmish style unit meant to ambush and surprise the enemy and scout and track them, moreover than just outright aggression and up close and personal. But don't let that confuse you here. While skinks are frail in combat, the Spitting Naja don't necessarily, at least from the lore standpoint here that the team has written out, don't kind of give that portrayal. They've got these hulking machetes that they use that it says that it would take a man 2 hands to wield one of them. So it's pretty cool that they've got these really heavy cleaving weapons. But their big kind of claim to fame is the fact that they are, well, Spitting Naja. They spit acid, they spit poison from their fangs. They have these big, huge hoods, kind of like cobras do. And I think that's a really cool distinction that the team has made to distinguish between Sarpa and Naja, because it's like you look at these guys on paper and it's like, oh, it's a naga, right? It's a snake man. And when you think about that from a typical fantasy standpoint, it's an anthropomorphic snake with the body of a man and the lower half of a snake. But they've done a way of kind of distinguishing between these two. They've even kind of baked that into the lore that the Spitting Naja have these large hoods because this allows them to have larger glands to then spit the acid, but it also makes them distinguishable on the battlefield so that the commanders can actually see them. And I think that that's cool because if you think about it from an actual Warhammer or a game standpoint of playing, you have actually a different silhouette to these units. So you're not just looking at a whole line of snakes with different armaments. You actually have different looking ones and pulling from different style of snake and species of snake, which I think is a really cool stance. And we get that represented in plenty of other races and factions of Warhammer, right? You could look at greenskins and go, okay, well, they're just all a bunch of greenskins. Well, no, you've got your orcs, then you've got your black orcs, which are much bigger and they're darker. You have got your goblins, which are much smaller, but then you've got night goblins within it. So kind of creating this color across different versions of, to use a fantastical term, naga, is really cool, different snake men. And the Spitting Naja have a pretty interesting role in that they do have this spitting acid. And let me read this little part from the lore here. It says, what physically differentiates them, however, are the larger fangs and a set of additional ribs on the sides of the Naja's neck. These ribs expand out along the skin on the neck to form a hood. Said hood not only grants them a more intimidating aspect, but also holds the glands that create and store the venom that the Naja spit. These glands are connected directly to the Naja's fangs, providing a continuous quantity of venom to use as long as they are fed on a steady supply of flesh and blood. So I do love this kind of role for these units, and the lore really kind of creates them to be this unit that is meant as a shock trooper, or one that, well, not necessarily a shock trooper, because when I think shock trooper, I think elite, but as a unit that's meant to track down and hunt beastmen. And they even kind of almost make a game of it. So individual Naja often engage in competitions in the heat of battle, wagering against each other to see who can hit the eyes of a razor gore at full charge with the venomous spit before nimbly dodging out of the way of the hurtling beast as it crashes through the undergrowth. And I love this kind of moniker that these guys are these backline harassment style unit that even kind of take wagers against one another. And the Naja, after a certain amount of time and dealing with kind of tracking the beastmen, because it says that the Naja are pretty adept at finding the beast paths that the beastmen use. And they can follow these beast paths and basically kind of ambush them while they're using it. But the veterans are these orb trackers. So let's read this port from the lore here. This part from the lore. Port's a delightful little dessert wine. This is not that. So the veterans among the Naja war parties are known as orb trackers. Perhaps as a consequence of having feasted upon so many beastmen, these elite Naja have grown an additional baleful eye on the back of their hood that is shielded by a protective membrane. This mutant eye gives the tracker vision of his entire surroundings when on the hunt, while also giving him the ability to sense unnatural glow of more sleep, however faint. And it kind of eventually goes on to become the lore for the chariot version that the Naja control, which we'll get into later in this video, because we'll be covering both the Sarpa version of the chariot and the Naja version of the chariot, because they've created a really cool differentiation between the two. So you now get the kind of fun lore here behind this, and I think that this could kind of come into Total War Warhammer 3 in a cool way. You could envision the Naja as a ranged hybrid unit, but I could maybe envision their spit, their projectile, as a little bit less of a range unit and more of like I say javelin because it's kind of become a moniker that even Creative Assembly has used to describe the limited range use of certain units. Or when you look at blue horrors, they are meant to kind of be a shorter range, smaller amount of ammunition shot unit, right? Like they shoot, then they're supposed to be, quote unquote, the front line, the front line for your Tzeentch army. And I kind of look at this in the same way here, right? Yes, sure, they do have this range, but if you read this part here, the Naja are the tireless hunters of the Snakemen castes, effortlessly stalking through the stifling jungles of Khuresh in their hunger for man-sized and monstrous prey. Once in range, the Naja spits its caustic venom at the eyes of large enemies, before executing the target up close with their wicked chopping blades. So this tells me that it's almost used as a preamble to a charge. So using this spit, I would look at as something that this unit would have a small ammunition, low range, but high possible, maybe even AP profile to it, which would be kind of cool, kind of unique, because maybe that's this thing's big impact, is that it can use this spit if it's within a certain close distance range, because then it's going to jump onto them and attack in close combat. And giving the unit stock, I think, makes a lot of sense. Maybe even giving it snipe or fire whilst moving, so that it can stalk right up to something, shoot, and then attack. And maybe that range is super limited. I'm not talking about like 120 stock snipe range. That's broken. I'm talking about something that's like 50, 60 range, where you're basically like right about to jump into your charge animation, and they can do this spit and move in. I think that's one thing that I've always not liked so much about javelin style units, those units that get a shot or two before something charges, is that it's meant to be almost used defensively, right? You use it, you throw the javelin, you shoot your pistol if you're Kislev, you launch a blue fireball if you're a blue horror, and then you charge in. Or then you receive the charge. I want this unit to charge, spit, and make the charge. Like, I want it to be one fluid motion. So I think that would be a really cool way to do it. And one thing I think that the Hinterlands of Khuresh needs would be a special damage type. And it'd be interesting if they did, and we already get special types of poison from the Dark Elves or from the Skaven, but it'd be cool if we got an even different one here for Khuresh, or maybe even just specifically for the Naja, where it was maybe called Acid, that would have a lot of the same effects of poison, maybe slightly reduced, but if it gave also a reduced Sundered Armor effect. So, okay, you've spit this poison out from your fangs in the initial charge, it reduces whatever intensity of reduction that it would mimic of poison onto the target, but also maybe rather than giving them the minus 40 armor of Sundered Armor, it maybe gives them a minus 20. So this unit charges in, and it's got these two heavy, huge machetes. So that, I think, it doesn't necessarily need to give it AP, but I think giving it anti-infantry would be a really cool thing. So you've got this unit that is meant to kind of be a backline harassing unit, quite quick because it is still a snake, and it can get really up close and personal, do this spitting charge, and then cleave things apart with these double machetes as it hacks its way through things. So that covers our lore here and our rules for the Spitting Naja. Let's now switch on over to the Pannaga Whirra. The next unit on our list here, and actually this is not a unit, this is a single entity. This is a hero unit for the Hinterlands of Khuresh, the Khuresh, and it is the Pannaga Whirra. Now, I'm told from the author here that the choice of name Whirra is actually kind of a bit of a play on words. It's a play on the Malay Sanskrit word for Whirra, which means hero. So it's cool that this is a hero unit and that it does whir things about. It says Whirra in its actual name, so it'll be whirring its little special whip about to do certain things. And this is a pretty cool unit. And when we talk about the actual battle map uses, the actual uses for it, and what I would expect for Total War Warhammer 3, I think we can get some pretty cool features out of it. But as far as the lore goes, the Whirra uses what's called the rhombus. And let me read the lore here for the rhombus for you guys. The rhombus has a deceptively simple design, an ornamented, weighted airfoil blade attached to a long cord of rope or chain that the user swings in a small circle in a vertical plane or in a large circle in a horizontal plane. When spun, the blade generates a roaring vibrato noise, resembling a mix of animal cries and howling wind. By adjusting the extent of its circuit, the swing speed, and the plane's rotation angle, the cadence of the sound produced can be manipulated, making it possible to code information or activate a variety of sorcerous effects enchanted into the tool. So you get this really interesting weapon here, or this item, and it's kind of a form of audio transmission. It's how the Khureshi talk over long distances, but they also use it offensively and defensively. So here's another little bit. Originally, the rhombus, remember that's the name of this thing, was a device that tapped into the winds of Azure and Gur, allowing Snakeman users to communicate across vast distances, dispel elemental attacks, and deflect the incoming lightning of dragon ogres that stalked the primeval world. So you get this thing that has a lot of use cases and is very integral to society, right? It's what allows this communication, what allows commanders to talk over the kind of tumult of the battlefield. And that's what we get to, is that these are the captains of the Snakemen armies, and they use this communication device not just simply offensively and defensively, but also, again, like I've said many times now, as this communication device. And I think that's a pretty cool mechanic, because we don't really necessarily get that very often in the lore as far as how many races communicate. We know that the Lizardmen, they use the what's it called? The Slann talk to the skinks, more or less. Talk is in quotes here. And then the skinks kind of use that information down into the Saurus. And we know that high elves can communicate with each other over vast distances through their mages and stuff like that. So we get kind of a little inkling of communications here and there, but very rarely do we get to hear exactly some of the devices that some races use altogether. So it's cool to see that here for Khuresh. Now, a big part of the Whirra is also their, not companion, but it's a blood-bonded spirit familiar. So let me read this. So like the Kanya, the Pannaga Whirra are also accompanied by a blood-bonded spirit familiar. In the Whirra's case, this entity takes the form of the Bajang or Bandersnatch, a darkly intelligent liminal being combining the physical traits of the gaunt Witchian cat and the tiger leech, which is a pretty disgusting combination of things right there. So let me read another little portion about the physical the physical description of the Bandersnatch here. Their 2 long prehensile tails can snare prey from a distance, terminating into 3-digit claws, ornamented with cursed rings. The Bajang's strangest and deadliest trait, however, is the seething liquid mist that perpetually emanates from its haggard body, which can be directed towards its foes as a caustic fog of crawling tendrils. So you get this creature that is constantly following and basically protecting the Pannaga Whirra. And the Pannaga Whirra goes through a ritual to bind this familiar to himself. So the Whirra itself, I guess you could say, is actually immune to this poisonous mist. And anything that comes close enough to the Whirra while the Whirra is doing its, whirring of the rhombus, gets ensnared by the familiar and then attacked and savaged by it. So you get this really cool kind of defensive being around what seems to be, from the lore, a support style hero. And that kind of pivots very well here into the discussion about how these mechanics might come to Total War Warhammer 3. And I think that this character would be pretty cool as a, again, purely defensive character, or a support character. For those of you that played Total War Rome 1, maybe you remember the witches of any of the barbarian tribes who could just like scream chants, and that was not a great mechanic for a whole unit to do, right? You kind of had this unit that would buff your army or debuff depending on which barbarian tribe you were playing as, and that would be kind of a cool in the sense that, yeah, you got those buffs going, but you had a whole unit just sitting there. But I think that could be brought back in a cool way for a hero unit in Total War Warhammer 3. Or if the Pannaga Whirra had maybe 2 or 3 bound abilities that, okay, if I'm using the rhombus in a horizontal plane, and that's obviously not what you would call the ability, it would be probably some sort of cool name specific to it, then it could debuff the enemy. Or if I'm using it on a vertical plane, it might buff my troops, maybe help with leadership, if we're talking about communication, right? Communication is often brought into the game in the form of leadership, as far as certain rules of other races talking about how, oh, this person has such a commanding presence and is able to communicate far and wide. Well, that's translated as leadership in the actual game's footprint. So having those bound abilities, and we've already seen that with the Wood Elves and their Regiment of Renown unit for the War Dancers, right, where they can actually switch between 2 bound different abilities. But I would like to see this for the Pannaga as something that actually kind of more or less locks them in place. Like, okay, they can't move around while they're doing this, and they can actually sit there and use these bound abilities. And these bound abilities would be even cooler if maybe one would give them certain bound spells or certain spells from Azure, which is the lore of heavens, or Gur, which is the lore of beasts. So you could have a Pannaga Whirra as either beasts or of heavens, getting some of these casting abilities added into it, which would be quite cool. And you have to remember too that you look at the actual art here for this. So it does have its rhombus in one hand, and again, this is drawn by the great Ruo Yu. So he's got the rhombus in one hand, then he has the pole arm in the other. So it does still pull from those characteristics of the Pannaga, right? We get that polearm weapon, we get that royal cast imbued in this character. So having anti-large and AP as part of a support character would be pretty interesting, because it kind of fits almost the role that the Ice Witches do, in that the Ice Witch is, I don't want to say a support character because it's a caster, but once you put an Ice Witch on a bear, It's pretty scary, you know. They can do some serious damage, and I think that that's kind of how the Whirra would be embodied here. Is yes, sure, it's supporting and it's buffing, but it can still do some nice AP anti-large damage. And just like you get with, say, the Skaven Warlock, who is not an absolute beast in close combat, but you know, it's doing AP and anti-large because it's got that halberd. So I wouldn't want to put, say, a glass cannon against it that is large. Also, the familiar. Another thing that we get already with the Ice Witch is the chance to summon these panthers, right? The snow leopards, not panthers, the snow leopards. So giving the ability for the Pannaga Whirra to summon up these Bandersnatches, I think would be a really, really cool, fun ability, and keep that kind of present in the game that we already get from the Ice Witch. As also a tool to kind of help deflect charges of maybe that are coming at the Whirra, as it is locked in its ability to use the buffs. Say, hey, you know, it's using its horizontal buff and it's debuffing the units around it. Well, I'm about to get charged, or I've got a pocket open that's going to be really hard to defend. I'll use the bound ability to summon this thing, because in the lore it's implied that it's already there, like kind of hanging out around the Whirra, ready to help out. And it's this ethereal thing too, so it would have some high physical resistance attached to it, and a great way to just kind of harass the enemy or get some really cool shock damage in if you're maybe getting pressed and getting focused down. So I think it's a really cool hero unit, and I really like how Ruo Yu did the armor. So the armor itself obviously looks great, but then you look at the silk and like the bands that kind of go down the actual snake body. It's really, really, really sick. It has a really cool ornate look to it, and it doesn't look super heavily armored, right? So it kind of does have that support hero look of, hey, this probably has a modest amount of armor, does some decent AP anti-large damage, but its real boon is all of the abilities that it brings to the fore. Let's switch over to some chariot units, because these are two that are pretty characteristic and pretty crazy here for Khuresh. And it's actually worth noting that I would see the character we just talked about, the Whirra, on a chariot as a mount option, because it does say that that is an option here in the lore, that if they kind of progress to a certain point, they can get themselves their own little chariot made by West Coast Customs with a built-in trumpet if they so wish. But again, let's now move into some more chariot units to talk about. Now, our first chariot unit I want to talk about is the Mazeracer Chariot. This one is helmed by the Naja, which we've already talked about before, but just to kind of refresh you, the Naja are the kind of skirmish ranged style variant of, well, not necessarily a variant of the Sarpa, but they're a variant of Snakemen, versus the Sarpa, which are a frontline melee style, right? So that should give you an idea of the overall use case of this Mazeracer Chariot. This is a ranged chariot. It is meant to be fast. It is meant to harass. And let's read this part right here from the lore. The Naja disdain the use of the halberds or reticulator net guns of the Sarpa charioteers, as they deem both as insulting to the biological weapons that they inherently possess, and venerate the Blood Naga Queen for bestowing upon them such gifts. These snake-like flailed hooks are also absent from their chariots, as the Naja prefer to stay away from close combat. So you get that right there. And the Sarpa variant of chariot, which we'll talk about in just a little bit, is a bit more of a hulking beast of a chariot. This one is different. This is even drawn by a different beast. And you might be thinking, what is it drawn by? Is it drawn by other snakes? Is it drawn by horses? Well, you'd be kind of right if you think horses. So let's read this. Unlike the more cumbersome Chorakhe drawn chariots of the Sarpa, the Naja chariots are drawn by a rare and haunting breed of beastmen found only in Khuresh, known as the Orobagor. With the head of a feral horse and unusually long hooved legs, these creatures appear like some abhorrent amalgamation of horse and ghoul, and they are. They definitely are. Cobol Yu has drawn this one here for the Mazeracer Chariot, and they are disgusting looking, but I love it, because more often than not, there is not necessarily a particularly keen intelligence behind a lot of beastmen until you get to the top end, right? You start to talk about a lot of the different gores and how they have different variations and flavors. You get into the young gores, you get into the leading cast of the beastmen. That's when you start to get the kind of beastman clever type of behavior that they often have. But you get this on the base level with the Orobagor, and I do love that a lot. Is that they seem to be very nefarious. They're filled with a lot of dar, as we know to be the dark wind of magic, more or less. And they essentially kind of to use a a word in the vernacular, they basically troll people. And I love that about them. And I think it's kind of a really cool little bit of lore, because they know that they look like this being that is just kind of staring off into the distance, staring up at the moon, but actually they're kind of very sentient, and they know what the hell's going on. Like, they know someone's looking at them, so maybe they'll run away or maybe they'll attack, and they can kind of apparate more or less, if you're thinking of a Harry Potter term, because they're so fast. So let's get this little part right here. As it travels, the Orobagor leaves sorcerous trails that wound reality, dragging objects and people that make contact with the shadowy strands into copses, miles away, into regions of the beast paths, or in rare cases directly into the dreaming wood that permeates the damned peninsula in their wake. So you get these things as very nefarious, very trickstery, right? Almost like sprites, and I kind of enjoy this imagery painted onto them versus the kind of typical beastman imagery of just like they blindly go to herd stones and go and attack stuff. While that is cool and it is a part of the lore of beastmen, I do like that this is a little bit different of a twist on it here in Khuresh. And how this kind of plays together is that the Naja, the orb trackers, remember we talked about them in the Naja section, they basically enslave these Orobagors to their will. And it's kind of a mark of, it's like the ultimate mark of expertise of an orb tracker as they start to get these Orobagor, because we know the Naja to be very kind of pompous about their ability and their prowess, and when it comes to shooting things with their venom, or we talked about how they basically gamble about that, right? And how they are really good and apt at sneaking up on people. And the orb tracker takes that to a next level. And they almost don't even want to be on these chariots. Like, oh, this is too in the eye. I want to be more clandestine. I want to be more sneaking up on things. I want to have more subterfuge about me. But again, like at the same time, it is a little bit of a badge of excellence. So let's read this little part about how they actually take the Orobagor into their service. So the veteran Naja makes use of an ensorcelled flayed hides of Bray shamans worn inside out to ward off the strange magic of the Orobagor, and in the event that they do get affected, simply guide themselves back to their prior location with their mutated Morrisely betuned eyes. The Naja can disable the werehorse's powers temporarily with a well-aimed shot to the eye, though the creature will regenerate from the damage quite quickly. In this brief window of near helplessness as the creature thrashes madly, the Naja deftly plucks the thickest spine out of the Orobagor's mane and places it within a specially constructed talisman of binding. Subdued, thusly, the Orobagor is placed under a curse of compulsion to serve its new master, which customarily leads to making up a team that draws the Naja's Ratha. Ratha is their chariot. So from there, these chariots basically harass the enemy. They are, like I said, not a close combat. They are meant for range, and we'll get into that a little bit here. But let me read this last little portion before we jump into those rules here. But they comprise roughly half the vanguard of Amarga's forces and are deployed as solitary units in battle, as the Mazeracers are even more egotistical than other Naja, and the confounding magic concentrated around the chariot endangers even their own allies. Through prolonged contact, the Orobagor's abilities infuse the chariot's structure, allowing the steering Naja to misdirect and displace entire enemy regiments as the chariots skirt the army's flanks. The elite of these Naja charioteers are known to disappear and reappear at will in a blur as they careen down the twisting roads of unreality navigable only to them. So, thinking of this from a mechanical standpoint, from a Total War actual gameplay standpoint, how would this actually be brought in? Because I already said that I would like to see the Naja as less of a longer ranged hybrid unit and more of a shorter ranged hybrid unit. And the Mazeracer Chariot, it's already kind of said, is not meant for combat. So I think that the Mazeracer Chariot would need to have a longer range to play with that. And how do you kind of deal with this whole basic ability to be seen and not seen all of a sudden, right? And I think this could be a cool thing, and it might be a broken thing, because it does say that, let's read this part here. The elite of these Naja charioteers are known to disappear and reappear. So maybe this is reserved for a regiment of renown. But I'd love if the Mazeracer Chariot had stock. It's a single entity. It wouldn't be a pack of 3 like we usually get with a lot of different chariots, or if we're playing Tomb Kings, a pack of like fucking 12. But our 6. I'd love to see, maybe it's 12, I can't remember. But either way, it'd be cool to see the Mazeracer Chariot have stock. Like, yeah, you don't even know it's on the battlefield until it's up close and personal in your grill, and it's starting to do range damage to you. Maybe even give it snipe, which might be a little too crazy. And okay, it jumps out of combat, it's starting to get attacked, it runs fast enough away, it goes back into stock. I would really love this thing to be defensive, or have its defensive capability be the fact that it can be so mobile that it can get out of the range to drop back into stock to come back to harass you, and that's kind of how you use it, rather than the typical fare of chariots of, okay, smash through the enemy when you can, especially even if you're a ranged one, and then just get out of dodge. It'd be fun if you had that ability, sure, but also you would do damage at range and then move away and go back into stock. And even it talks about how it leaves this trail of destruction, so it'd be very interesting if you had to be kind of careful, because this would do friendly damage, but if you did decide to run through the enemy, it would leave a trail that would do perpetual damage and slow things down. And of course, that would hit your own units if they ran into it. I did have kind of like a harebrained idea that would be pretty interesting if it had like a bound ability that would enable an enemy unit to be stalked for the enemy. And that sounds very convoluted, but basically what I'm saying is I click the ability, I click an enemy's unit, and the enemy can no longer see that unit for like 15 seconds, but I can. So they can't give it orders, they can't do anything with it, they don't even know its health, anything like that. Like, that'd be kind of crazy. It almost would look as if it's on your side, but it's not. I think that's way too hard to actually code into the game or whatever, but I think that'd be kind of cool. Is like basically you're forcing this thing to be hidden, and your enemy can't even do anything to maybe remove it from combat. So this is basically like a forced rampage that also they can't do anything about. They can't even target to heal it or anything like that, which would be kind of maybe a little too nuts. So I thought of that as a bound ability, but I think a little too harebrained here. So let's go into the other and final unit on our list here, the Sarpa-controlled chariot. So that Sarpa chariot, the Chorakhe Chariot, is a little bit different, of course, than your Mazeracer. And we're going to get into this, and it's pretty cool. And what I like a lot about the lore here for a lot of these Khureshi units is that it dips back into their origin story, right? And we know from their origin story to them kind of being this, not necessarily corrupted offshoot of Lizardmen, but a different approach to Lizardmen that the old ones decided to take. And there are a lot of the vestiges of what make the Lizardmen present in the earliest lore of Khuresh that I really like is kind of brought to the fore in some of these units, with, of course, the Chorakhe here. And it is unlike the Mazeracer. A single entity pulls this cart, this Ratha as it's called, this chariot, and on top of it is two Sarpa warriors. Now remember again, one more time, Raja are the ranged, Sarpa are the close combat. So here's a little blurb from the lore here. Devolved lizardmen deliberately kept alive and raised from corrupted spawning pools known as the Uraga are made to draw the ornate chariots, as much of their endurance and brute strength as it allows their snakemen handlers to flaunt their superiority over the hated children of the old ones. You kind of see this this feud between the two races coming to the fore again. And another portion of this Chorakhe or Capragors, the devolved form of Croxagors, are often chosen to draw Sarpa chariots as they are brutal and single-minded creatures, useful for barging through enemy formations, rending those that bar their way before making it through to the other end of the enemy formation to restart the charge or the carnage. And as you would imagine, again, this is that close combat variant of chariot here. It's meant to be very shocky, very almost like a gore beast chariot, right? Just get in there, do that heavy, heavy, heavy damage. And I like that this is a single, effectively Croxagor pulling this thing and ripping through stuff. You get a really cool bit of imagery here. The Chorakhe reptilians stand in slouched bipedal posture when idle, but assume a quadrupedal stance when they have to move fast or charging towards their prey. And looking at that from an imagery standpoint is pretty cool, right? Like when it's just standing there, it hinds up on its two legs, and the cart itself, is going to have to tip back for that. So to see the idle animation in Total War Warhammer 3, if that were ever to happen, it'd be a really cool kind of a look to the chariot, something very different. And that's what I think is really cool about a lot of the Khureshi units is it takes that standard format of look that Warhammer has had created across so many different races, right? Dark Elves, High Elves, Tomb Kings, Chaos, beastmen, everyone's got a chariot in some way, shape, or form. And for the most part, it follows the same silhouette. It's a chariot. You really can't go crazy with a chariot. But I do like just simply making it so that a creature that walks on 2 legs but runs on 4 legs is what's drawing this thing. So it just hinds up, and the chariot's silhouette is going to change when it's idle, which is pretty interesting there. But let's get a little bit here into the Sarpa that ride the chariot, because that's going to kind of dictate how this thing would come into the game from a mechanical standpoint, right? The snakemen on board the chariot are armed with vicious halberds, which tend to be coated with a paralytic agent to expedite captures, while more fatal concoctions would be issued during times of war. A noted equipment that the Chorakhe drawn charioteers are known to employ is the Entangler, a handheld projectile launcher of eldritch design that fires a writhing net to hold down prey, used against crowds of infantry or a single large beast. So that just brings us right here into the mechanics for this and what it might look like in Total War. And I think that obviously, right, you're going to get AP, you're going to get anti-infantry from just the sheer nature of having a Kroxigor bulldoze through things, but also the scything blades on the side of this thing, the halberds that these guys are using. So I don't think it would have a dual profile of AP, anti-infantry and anti-large, even though they're using halberds. I think that just being anti-infantry fits the profile, obviously, of a chariot. We get that plenty of times over and over and over. But it's cool here to hear about this Entangler, which I do envision very much in the same way that we get for the Dark Elves, having some sort of a bound ability that does a lot of damage. This, rather than doing damage to a large entity, it's meant to lock something down. So that I think is pretty cool, right? Launching this huge net, almost like a net of Amontok, and locking something in place. Now, it might be fair to apply this only to the Regiment of Renown unit. Who knows? If there is one, if there ever was one. So maybe that could be how this could be translated. The Entangler is only present on a Regiment of Renown. That way you're not having like effectively 2, 3, 4 of these in a unit or in an army and just locking down all the important stuff, bursting it down and moving on. So I think there has to be a bit of a balance there, or maybe, of course, it just has a high cooldown, whatever it is. But I think as far as mechanics go, it's a very one-to-one. It's a very easy translation here. It's just a beast of destruction. And I guess, too, the question is, would it be a single entity chariot, much like we have with the Mazeracer, or would it be like a 3-unit chariot? And I think that making this as a 3-unit chariot or 4-unit chariot, if you're on ultra size, fits just fine. So I think that would fit here for the Chorakhe Chariot. So a very interesting and different chariot here for Khuresh. Now that having talked about these 4 units, it's a lot of fun to see how this Khuresh fan project is really fleshing out, right? A lot of really cool characterization behind a lot of these units, a lot of really cool motivation behind them from the lore, from the actual art direction. So it's been a lot of fun. We will jump into 4 more units in a continuation of this video. Like I said, I think we're overall like 9 or 10 behind. So we do have quite a little bit. And then we're going to culminate all of this, every single unit, in its own kind of army list video, like I've done plenty of times before for, say, Cathay, as a result of Cobol Yu's actual drawings, or that we've done for any of the ones that are present in 8th edition, just to kind of give it that overall 8th edition treatment and to put it all in one cohesive video. And I won't go through and take the previous videos I've done and throw it in there. I'll probably make things custom for it, and we'll have a different discussion, because now that we have Warhammer 3, the mechanics discussion for the game differs. In our previous videos, we were really talking about it from the scope of Warhammer 2, unaware of what we were going to get in Warhammer 3, but now that we know, we have a little bit more to go off of when it comes to certain mechanics and things that have been kind of quote-unquote unlocked to us in the 3rd game. So go ahead and let me know in the comment section below what you're feeling about the Khureshi fan project. I know, again, what Andy Hall said, so ignore that portion of this. What we're really doing is just having some fun speculation and going into the Khuresh fan project and kind of showing some of this stuff off. And again, I will be providing links to the artists, both Cobol and Ruo Yu, Cobol Yu and Ruo Yu, that you can find in the description, as well as a link to the World Anvil website, so you can take a look at all the work that they've already done, some of the units we haven't even touched on, and the units that are coming, so you can just kind of follow along with the project. But as always, guys, thank you so much for watching here today. Have a good one, and take care.